Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see that you came back. That's always good when you're not required to. So I just wanted to take a moment to say probably the first half, part one, is going to be a little bit longer than 40 minutes, but then we'll still take a break, and then part two will hopefully be shorter. It will definitely be shorter. We're still going to end on time. And hopefully I'll get everything in that I have planned, but if not, I'll figure something out for next week. Okay, so you'll remember, hopefully, that last week when we left off, I had just told some stories about some slaves from Basile's collection, The Tale of Tales. And in addition, I circulated those, so hopefully you had a chance to read them, so you got a little bit more detail than I was able to provide last week.
Because we didn't see that.
Oh, Barry, I sent them to Barry maybe the day after the class, and he circulated them.
If you didn't get it, we'll make sure we get it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, so they would have come in an email from Barry.
Is it recorded?
There is a
Yes.
recording.
They will get to use it.
Okay.
No pressure. Yes.
So one of the things, so fortunately, if you didn't read those, I am going to talk about a story in the second half of the class, and I don't really have time to go into very much detail, but I think you'll be able to understand what's happening and then hopefully go back and read that story. So last week I kind of summarized those stories in which slaves feature very prominently in Basile's collection, The Tale of Tales. And as I mentioned last week, I now today want to situate those in an historical, cultural, and literary / fairy tale framework that I think will really help us understand more fully how ideas about race underpin this foundational collection of European fairy tales. And then, of course, as a result, because they underpin this foundational collection, how they also underpin the very development of the genre itself as we see over time. So just to recap very quickly, you may remember last week I mentioned that Basile spent most of his life as a courtier around Naples. And Naples at the time was a port city as part of the Spanish Empire, and it had been part of the Spanish Empire from the early 16th century. This is all just to say that Naples itself, as a port city especially, was quite diverse. But even before Basile started working in courts, he worked as a young man as a soldier of fortune for the Venetian Republic in an island called Candia, which today we know as Crete. And at the time, that was right on the border of the Ottoman Empire, and it was facing the Ottoman Empire. So Basile also had that experience, which I think is foundational. In addition, or I guess all of this is to say that Basile spent much of his adult life in very multicultural and diverse environments. Naples itself had a very recognizable Muslim community, and around maybe 7% of the city's overall population was comprised of slaves. And those slaves had been brought from all the reaches of the Mediterranean. So that would include the Middle East, what we know today as the Middle East. It would include Eastern Europe, as well as North Africa, and even Sub-Saharan Africa. And so because of the location of the Mediterranean, because of the location of Naples and the particular form of slavery, which I'm just going to call Mediterranean slavery, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, Naples and Basile were surrounded by or immersed in a culture that had distinctly recognizable Muslims, as well as Black Africans, some of whom were free, some of whom had been freed, and some of whom were enslaved. In addition, the Spanish courts that in Naples, the Neapolitan courts that were part of the Spanish viceroy, where Basile worked, had formerly enslaved people who had converted to Christianity, as well as Italian and Spanish men of letters. So again, just to give a sense of the richness of Basile's environment from a kind of demographic perspective, if you will. So that's just a little snapshot for us to hold in mind as we think about Basile's collection, but also more of the historical period. So another thing that's important to keep in mind when we talk about slavery in Basile's collection and in his period is that this was a different form of slavery than the one that we as Americans are most familiar with, right? This was not the transatlantic slave movement or system. This was what, at least in the early days, what we could call the Mediterranean or Roman system of slavery. And it was really distinct from, again, the transatlantic slave movement or era or trade is the right word, because it was largely motivated by war and by piracy. And as a result, this Mediterranean form of slavery was temporary. That is, people were enslaved, they were ransomed, they were freed, they were traded among these big groups that were intersecting around the Mediterranean. So Europeans, Ottomans, North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, they all participated in selling, trading, ransoming, hijacking, and enslaving each other, often for temporary periods of time. And there were specific legal and religious procedures for paying ransoms and for freeing people. So again, very temporary relative to North America, or transatlantic slavery, which was a lifelong condition. In addition, in Mediterranean slavery, slaves were often manumitted upon the death of their owners. Mark, do you have a question?
Yeah, it sounds to me that there's a striking difference between that type of slavery and the slavery of our history, is that if you're walking in the street in Naples and you see a great variety of people with different physical characteristics, you wouldn't have a set of assumptions about what their worth is and what their status is. You don't know.
They would not necessarily be enslaved at the moment that you recognize them, that you saw them, but that's not to say that there wasn't a cultural apparatus or framework for understanding them as a particular form of person with a particular value. And I'll talk about that in a second. So I think there, in our context, for the most part, the vast majority of people that people would have interacted, the vast majority of African people that whites would have interacted with or seen would have been enslaved, right, in our context. And that would have automatically conveyed a particular kind of value, is what you're saying. It's true that in the Neapolitan context, Black Africans wouldn't have so easily been identifiable as slaves, but it's not to say that the same kinds of perceptions of human value and the same kinds of stereotypes didn't also adhere to them. Okay. And as I'll talk about in a moment, this is an early form of Mediterranean slavery, and it did change over time. So, but as Mark is pointing out, at any time in Naples, there would have been Black Africans who were enslaved, who were free Black Africans always, and who had been freed from various mechanisms. This temporary aspect of Mediterranean slavery, of course, also meant that people could be enslaved more than once over the course of their lives, right? They could be captured in war, released, they could be captured by pirates and ransomed, and then that could happen again, depending on their circumstances. So last week, you may remember, Barry asked this question about the different kinds of slavery and who was represented in these areas, in Naples in particular. And I mentioned that this was a transitional moment between two different distinct forms of slavery. So there was, on the one hand, what I'm calling Mediterranean slavery, which I just described, and which Stephen Epstein, an historian who's done excellent work on the way that the language of slavery and ideas about slavery are built into modern Italian as a language. He describes this Mediterranean form of slavery as, quote, non-racist, especially in the Western Mediterranean. And then the other form of slavery, which this early Mediterranean form was in the process of becoming, is really the early slave trade of early modern Europe, right? And that's a comprehensive system of human bondage. And as Epstein points out, and I would completely agree, quote, it is profoundly racist. So hold that in mind for 1 second. At the same time, there's a parallel transition happening in ideas about how Blackness was perceived. So Blackness, for many centuries, was associated with evil, with the devil, with everything negative, right? At this same moment, Blackness was in a period of transition and becoming a term that was applied specifically to certain kinds of people. And of course, all the negative associations of Blackness were going with it, stayed with it as they were being applied to people. So for Epstein, and I totally agree, in this period, we have two sets of transitions that are working together. We have the transition from Mediterranean slavery, which is kind of a spoils of war and piracy kind of slavery, to slavery as a system of human bondage. And we also have the transition from Blackness as a general abstract association with evil and negativity to a very specific association with particular kinds of people, Black-skinned or dark-skinned people, carrying forward those associations. And Epstein introduces these two transitions and shows in great detail how they're interrelated. And he wants to say somewhere in this transitional period lay the roots of racism, okay? And what I want us to think about today is also in this same period of transition, the creation and publication of Basile's collection, The Tale of Tales, right? So we're informed by the same kinds of ideas. So, yes.
Excuse me, we're pretty much near the time of Shakespeare, and in the sonnets, the Dark Lady sonnets, My Love is Black. Was there anything similar to that use of black in the language that Vasily was using?
You mean where there's some positive resonances?
I'm sorry, my hearing is terrible. I'm just trying to quote a bit of the sonnet, My love is black but beautiful, or something like that. Obvious, and then it goes on, dark hair, dark eyes, but white skin.
Mm-hmm.
Would black have been used in a similar way in the language Vasily was using ever?
Can you somehow summarize the question for the Zoom participants?
Yes, so that's a question of whether, given the proximity of time, whether Shakespeare's references to Black but beautiful in some ways, right, is carried forward in Basile. And it's a little bit of a complicated question because that line from Shakespeare actually comes from the Book of Solomon, where you have a Black maiden who is referred to as Black but beautiful, or Black and beautiful. And the term in the Hebrew has the potential to mean but, and it has the potential to mean and. And so exegesis of the Bible has, more recent exegesis of the Bible has shown that over a long historical reading of that line about the Black maiden, that biases about skin color led to a kind of concretization of the line as I am Black but beautiful. But more recent readers of the Bible and, scholars of the Bible have it interpreted as potentially saying I'm Black and beautiful. And they've established that in philological kinds of ways. So there are maybe a few references in Basile where that could be read, but it's not so common. In Basile, it's really Black, especially for females, and we see this in the characterization of the female slaves, is associated with ugliness. The Black but / Black and beautiful gets picked up in the Grimms a little bit more in the 19th century. And I'll talk about that when we get to that section. Okay. So let's see. So again, Epstein is kind of saying between these two transitions, between the transition from the one form of slavery to a system of human bondage, and from Blackness as associated with negativity general to being specifically associated with people, lay the roots of racism. And this may seem to us like a pretty big claim or an over-exaggeration. And I just want to suggest that I don't think that really matters. Like, even if it's not the roots of racism, it might be the roots of some racism or some of the roots of racism. I think what Epstein's getting at and what I want to foreground is that during this time period, we're beginning to see the coalescence of ideas that are the roots of our current understanding of race and our many centuries of racism. And they're mapped on very specifically to slavery. And the emergence of those racist ideas, the emergence of these ideas about Blackness also justified the new kind of system of slavery as that is a trade having to do with human bondage versus the spoils of war kind of piracy sort of system. Okay, so if we think about the origins of racism in this moment and the production of Basile's collection at the same moment, I think we can see some of the ways that Basile is engaging, reproducing, and even perhaps magnifying the same kinds of cultural ideas that were in circulation at the time. So if we return to the slaves that we left at the end of the last class, yes.
Before you, that I hope we can tell us a little bit about the transition that's going on in the two systems. What's motivating that? What changes are happening?
Yeah, it's a transition that's happening over a fairly big period of time, right? Like decades, if not a century. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly. But the argument that Epstein makes, and that I'm pretty persuaded by, is that it was ideas about Blackness, right, that were beginning to get mapped onto people that rationalized a different kind of bondage or a different kind of slavery, right? And he doesn't know exactly what it is, there's not one specific thing, but it's this convergence of a lot of ideas, right? Some religious, some cultural, that are feeding this kind of system. And then you also have at the same time the transatlantic slave trade, and European countries are of course participating in that quite actively. So I think part of it is just that kind of influence as well. Yeah. So if we go back to the slaves that we left off with at the end of the last class, I think we can really see in these characters, and especially in the female slaves, how they condense, dominant beliefs about slaves in the Italian cultural imagination of the period. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit more. So according to Basile's tales, slaves, again, especially the female slaves, are prone to duplicity, they're prone to thievery, they're generally untrustworthy, they're willing to use pregnancy to better their situations, they're linguistically deficient, and especially they're deserving of unchecked physical and verbal abuse. And if you read the stories, or when you read the stories, I think you'll really be able to see that. At the same time, their ethnic and religious otherness, that is, they're called Moors, they're called Saracens, they're referred to by the label Allah lover. So their religious and ethnic differences are tethered to their Blackness, and punctuated by racialized physical descriptions such as cricket-legged, thick-lipped, and wiggle-ass, right? These are from the stories that I talked about last week, some of which you saw because I showed those excerpts. So all of these descriptions were part of a very culturally recognizable language of racial and ethnic difference for Basile's audience. They might not be the descriptors that we would automatically think of when we think of stereotypes of Blackness, but in their cultural context, they totally make sense. And this I'll unpack a little bit too. So as you may remember, in addition to these everyday references, right, many of Basile's descriptions are like extensive, elaborate metaphors. And in those metaphors, he deepens the association between Blackness and a dehumanized otherness. So you might remember I read a little bit from the end of the Three Citrons when the prince returns and he is, goes up and he sees the beautiful fairy who is now replaced by Georgia. And some of the examples of Basile's metaphors of dehumanized Blackness, but that refer to people, include a mass of black flesh, a black thing, a black knight of a slave, a statue of jet, an ink blot, the black mourning draped on the freshly whitewashed house. And even when Basile moves beyond these general kind of metaphors of Blackness, he's still, to describe people, to describe slaves, he still dehumanizes them in a language of animality. So throughout the collection, slaves, again, especially female slaves, are often referred to as monkey, bitch, crow, horse. So again, very dehumanizing kinds of language and metaphors. Even though this language is metaphoric, I want us to think about it as a material language of slavery, or I like to call this a material language of slavery because it relates specifically to material human beings, that is, people who were enslaved, and also because Basile's collection is run through with a second language of slavery, and that is a figurative language of slavery. So I don't have time to go into all the background of that figurative language of slavery, but I'll say very quickly that I argue that it has its roots in the Roman love elegy, which was a classical poetic form that was anchored by the servitium amoris, or slave to love trope. And it would have been very widely known by educated people like Basile. And as with everything in this class, I would be more than happy to talk with you at any point about the kind of extensive origins of the servitium amoris trope and Basile's figurative language. Or I can do like a totally shameless plug and say it's all in my book, which is coming out in December. But really, this the collection is run through, as you can imagine, from the few things that I've read to you or that you've read of Basile. It's run through with this incredibly extensive metaphoric language, and much of that has to do with being enslaved figuratively, right? Being the slave to love, which is very different than the other kinds of language of slavery. So there is this other figurative language of slavery. So on the one hand, all those metaphors that I mentioned before about Blackness, even though they're metaphoric, let's think of that as the material language of slavery in Basile. And then I want to talk a little bit about this figurative language of slavery that reverberates through the whole collection and eventually coalesces with the material language of slavery. So in one of the stories called The Two Little Pizzas, which is a good black and white bride story, it turns out, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to the lectures on the Grimms. But in this story, Basile uses a metaphor to describe nightfall. And the metaphor is this: when the black Moor of a night came out to play tuba katuba with the stars. Okay, we don't know what this means in our period, so let's put it in its cultural context. In its cultural context, this is a metaphor of racialized ethnic difference, and it encodes a whole series of associations implicit in the cultural references, which, don't worry, I'm going to unpack. And it eventually leads us back to the two slave girls who are so important to the stories that motivate this whole collection. So, tuba katuba is the first thing that we have to understand. It's a dance similar to Spesania, which is often conflated with the dance of Lucia, also commonly known as bitchy Lucia. You'll remember that Georgia, the slave in the three citrons, refers to herself as Lucia, right? That was a generic term for slave, which I'll get to in a moment. But for us to understand a little bit more about what this dance of Lucia means, we can look at a footnote from a 2002 collection, an Italian translation of the Neapolitan of the Tale of Tales, which was then translated and cited in Nancy Canepa's 2007 English translation. So we learned that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Moorish dance of Lucia was widely performed in Naples. It derived from the ecstatic dances of possession, characterized by continuous spinning, like those that today are still performed by dervishes. Already desacralized in the 16th century, it was transformed into a ritualistic carnival performance. The ambiguous character of Lucia was played by a man in blackface, dressed as an Oriental woman, whose song and movements referred to the sexual act, birth, death, and resurrection. The accompanying chorus insulted Lucia with the epithet bitch. Later, this dance was confused with the dance of Sisfania, which took its name from the city of Fez in Morocco. Okay, so this tells us a lot, I think, and it tells us about how common this performance was. In addition, Lucia was a stock character in a genre of street theater. I think something's missing from my slide. In any case, a genre of street theater that was known as the Luciate. I think that's the plural version. And there was one, oh, I know it's, I don't know what happened. I didn't set up my animation right. There was at least one published version. So it's pretty amazing that there is a published version from 1628 because this was street theater. So this published version is called The New Luciata, brought to light by a ruined poor man for the satisfaction of the virtuous. Again, published in 1628 in Naples. So around the same time that Basile was writing and right before the posthumous publication of his collection. Yes.
So about Santa Lucia.
Yes,
Which is a celebration in the church, both in Northern Europe as well as Southern Europe. And all the young ladies are dressed in white.
Yeah, so last week when we talked about Basile's style generally, that one of the elements of the Baroque for him was a lot of inversion. So he was bringing kings down to speak in the language of the street. He was kind of making fun of the highborn, et cetera, right, by mixing these forms and inverting that. So my reading, and other people have read this play on Lucia and Santa Lucia as another one of his inversions. Aside from the fact that Lucia was this common name given to female slaves, and that there was all of this street theater, basically popular culture, involving the character Lucia as a Moor or as a Black, often called negress, definitely a slave. Despite that, which I think is enough evidence to convince us that what Basile is doing in the collection has to do with that culture, there's also this other layer of that Santa Lucia figure who is pure, who's part of the church, right? And that is getting inverted in Basile's kind of Baroque play. That's the argument I would make. A couple other people have made that argument too. So one of the fascinating things about this published version is that it was written in a theatrical language that is very akin to the Moorish patois that Basile's two slave girls used. And here, as in the dance that we just read about, Lucia is portrayed as a flirt who dances in uninhibited ways that mimic copulation, and that her infidelity in this genre of street theater results in her having an illegitimate child at the end of the play. So these highly racialized and sexualized Lucias from Neapolitan dance and street theater help us make sense of some of the characteristics that Basile invokes for his slave girls that might not make sense to us in our own cultural register, like wiggle ass, right? That's one of the descriptions that for us, we might not necessarily associate with an offensive stereotype of Blackness, but in Basile's time makes a lot of sense given how highly sexualized the Lucia character was in these kinds of performances, right? She is in essence defined by her improper sexuality. As I mentioned though, Lucia is more than just simply the name, and clearly it's not a Moorish name. So it's more than a name that's given to this dance of caricatured and offensive otherness. As I mentioned in passing last week and maybe earlier today, Lucia was one of the two or three most common names that were given to slaves when they, to female slaves when they arrived in Italy. And by Basile's time, it had clearly come to serve as a generic term for female slave. So again, you'll remember that at the in the Three Citrons, the slave girl, when she's fetching water and she misrecognizes the fairy's reflection for her own, twice she refers to herself as unfortunate Lucia. And that's part of her bemoaning her life as a slave. And that Lucia isn't her proper name, we learn a little bit later when she refers to herself as Georgia. So although it may be lost to us, it certainly wouldn't have been this kind of ironic humor of Georgia referring to herself as Lucia certainly would not have been lost on Basile's audiences, Basile's contemporaries. And as one historian of 16th and 17th century Italian theater has pointed out, there was another form called the Mooresque, also known as the dance of the Black man. So you remember from the dance of Lucia, we have the man in blackface dressed as a woman. So similar. So the Mooresque, which refers to the dance of the Black man, as well as to pantomimes and other street forms that emerged or derived from that dance, had, quote, regular Negro characters who were the comical negresses, Georgia and Lucia. So these are two names of widely known female slaves who were Black and comical stock characters, right? So for Basile to work this into the Three Citrons would have been funny, right, for his audiences, even if that humor is kind of lost on us. As you'll also remember, Georgia's use of the generic term Lucia to refer to her slave status in the Three Citrons also sets the stage for the unmasking of the slave princess. And when that happens, for the very first time in the whole collection, the slave princess is referred to by her proper name, that is the name she's given as a slave, which is Lucia, okay? So in both of these instances, in both of these stories, it is the slave girl's improper sexuality, their status as false brides, that drives the story. And so, like with so many fairy tales, Lucia, I would argue, is operating as what we would call an aptronym. That is a name that is particularly apt for its character. And we see this in fairy tales all the time, right? Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Beauty, the Beast, right? These names, it's a very common fairy tale form. And so Lucia, being a common name for slave, is also functioning, I would say, in this way. And I think this becomes very clear in the conclusion when Basile writes, quote, Lucia truly acted like a Lucia as she listened to Zosa's story, right? So she began exhibiting these traits associated with slaves. Okay, so just to kind of close out this example, these layered cultural associations implicit in Basile's metaphor of that Black Moor of a night playing tuba katuba, they call attention to the figurative language of racialized ethnicity that cannot be separated, I would argue, from ideologies of slavery in Basile's. And even more, as I think, I hope I've showed, that this particular movement from metaphor, that is the Black Moor of a night playing tuba katuba, to materiality, the two slave girls, highlights the tightly bound nature of Basile's two languages of slavery. They facilitate each other and they augment each other, okay? So let me turn now quickly to the two other slaves who figure prominently in Basile's collection. That is the two handsome Black slaves that we met in The Padlock and in The Golden Trunk. And here I want to move away from the two languages of slavery and talk a little bit about the literary and fairy tale context for these stories that I think also helps us excavate, if you will, indulge that language, some of the racialized meanings of Basile's collection. So as I mentioned last week, and as you probably noticed if you had an opportunity to read these stories, both of them are versions of Cupid and Psyche. And the most famous, well-known version of Cupid and Psyche we have is from Apuleius's 2nd century CE collection, The Golden Ass. And most fairy tale scholars have generally read these two Basile stories in relation to Apuleius's version. That's no surprise there. But I think when we really begin to think about it, that classical Roman version leaves quite a few details from Basile's two stories unexplained, right? For instance, why does Basile transform the figure of Cupid, the god of love and the son of Venus, into a handsome Black slave called Thunder and Lightning, who's the son of an ogress? That seems like an especially perplexing transformation, right? If Apuleius is the primary source, if Basile is really rewriting Cupid and Psyche. Even in The Padlock, which is the much less elaborated version, where the handsome Black slave is never given a name like Thunder and Lightning, we still are left with the same question. He's still cursed to be a handsome Black slave, and he's still the son of an ogress, right? So he's still an odd transformation of the Cupid character. In a footnote, again, Nancy Canepa, who translated directly from the Neapolitan into the English, so her translation is usually considered definitive. She has a footnote to The Golden Trunk where she just points out, this is one of the many stories in Basile's collection that shares tropes with the Cupid and Psyche story. And she provides a little bit more detail from another translator of the collection. And she says, quote, Penzer, that translator, discusses a very similar Greek tale and hypothesizes that Basile may have derived his from it. There are also variants from Turkey and Crete, and Basile could have heard one of these while in Venice or Crete, where he was stationed during 1604 to 1607, though it does not seem that he knew either Turkish or modern Greek. So again, given Basile's travels through the Mediterranean, the fact that the Mediterranean was itself highly diverse, the fact that Naples was a port city, that the Mediterranean and Naples facilitated a great deal of cultural and mercantile exchange, it wouldn't be surprising if Basile was familiar with Greek and Turkish versions of stories. We know that stories circulated in the same routes that finance and goods and people did. So even if he didn't know Greek or Turkish, he may have been familiar with those versions of the story. But that doesn't help us that much because those versions still don't account for some of the real oddities of the details and some of the most striking motifs in the Golden Trunk especially. Variants, however, from North Africa bear a striking resemblance to the Golden Trunk. And even more, I think this is fascinating, these two scholars, Emmanuel Plantade and Najima Plantade, argue very convincingly on philological grounds that Apuleius's Cupid and Psyche is in fact derived from the Berber oral tradition. And this shouldn't be very surprising to us because Apuleius himself was of Berber origin, right? So this oral tradition of North Africa certainly could have influenced Apuleius. What we see when we do close comparison of all of the texts is that Basile's Golden Trunk, in particular, tracks much more closely with the North African oral tradition, the oral versions, than it does with Cupid and Psyche. And also, the Cupid and Psyche tale is part of a tale tradition that's very big. It has a very big umbrella. And it's also known as the Son of the Ogress tales, and Beauty and the Beast also fits under there, as do Animal Bridegroom tales. So we're going to be talking about that more as the class goes on. But just to give a couple examples, so in addition to sharing all the major plot points, that is the mysterious nocturnal visits, the prohibition against looking at the lover, the girl's transgression of that, her banishment, the mother as the ogress, the son's help in the girl accomplishing the tasks that the mother sets, the mother's death and the eventual marriage and happily ever after ending. In addition to that, the Berber versions from oral tradition have the same tasks. And so the two primary tasks that we see are the sorting of seeds and beans, which also is in Cupid and Psyche, and the filling of like a dozen huge mattresses with feathers from a bird. So the supernatural lover figure in Cupid and Psyche, as well as the Berber oral tradition, as well as in the Golden Trunk, instructs the girl to call on the ants to help her, which she does. When it comes to feather collecting, which doesn't even exist in Cupid and Psyche, thunder and lightning and the lovers in the Berber oral tradition and other North African oral tradition, other versions from North Africa, tell the heroine how she can enlist or how she can invoke the king of birds to get all the birds to help her fill the feathers, right? And I should note that, just as an aside, in some of the Berber versions, the king of birds is sometimes the name used for the supernatural royal protagonist like thunder and lightning. But I don't think the fact that that's a different usage detracts from the point that Basile is probably drawing from these versions, since he is using still the king of birds as a proper name. And if you had a chance to read the material, he says, let all the birds know that the king of birds is dead, and they'll pound their chest in such, or they'll flutter their wings in such agony and mourning that all their feathers will come down and they'll fill these mattresses for you. Okay, let's see. So besides the king of birds, other names also kind of carry forward, I think, in my reading, I think they carry forward. So in one tale from North Africa, Plantad and Plantad point out that the supernatural lover's name is Asfer an Ibwa, which can be translated as whistling of the rain. And in an Eastern Moroccan version, the name is Sefar Ibwar, or whistling of the wind. And these names, I think, resonate with or evoke for us thunder and lightning as the given name of the supernatural lover in Basile. In another tale, also from the same region, that is from North Africa, when the supernatural lover learns of the heroine's transgression, he exclaims, quote, "Ah, moonlight," that's the heroine's name, "I trusted you and you betrayed me." And here, I think this lover's sense of betrayal accords with thunder and lightning's eventual use of traitor as a proper name to refer to Parmetella when they're reunited at the ogress's house, right? And for the rest of that story, he refers to her only by traitor as a sort of formal name, right? It's capitalized and everything. So if we look at the very broad tradition of this tale type, and again, it's a huge tale type, I think that we get some helpful hints into the undeniable significance of the early racial thinking in Basile's collection. What is most remarkable to me is that when we look at the Cupid and Psyche tradition, the Beauty and the Beast tales, Animal Bridegroom, Son of the Ogress tales, there are only 2 tales that we know of that have Black slaves as these characters, and they are the 2 tales in Basile's collection. So given Basile's interest in race and slavery and his racialization of slaves throughout this collection, it's not hard to imagine that he would associate a North African tale with Black African slaves and write his tales with them as the main protagonists. So just to wrap up our time with Basile's The Tale of Tales, I think we can see how the dominant cultural ideas about Blackness, which are especially clear in the female slaves, in Basile's descriptions of Lucia and Georgia as ugly, as deceptive, as dangerous, we can see how they reinforce the tales, all of the tales in the collection, the equation of Blackness with being punished, right? Or living in a cursed state. And this is what we see very obviously in the Padlock and in the Golden Trunk. The ideological underpinnings of these 2 tales really echo longstanding ideas about slavery that were, and the ways that slavery was justified, as I mentioned earlier, on racial and ethnic grounds. And here again, I want to quote Stephen Epstein, who I think really captures this idea beautifully in a succinct way. And so there is a kind of declension from bad luck, different things that Blackness meant, right? Bad luck to sin to force as evolving, overlapping, even mutually confirming explanations for slavery. Ethnicity or color came to be a proxy for bad luck. In more complex ways, color also became a proxy for sin itself, as people came to believe that belonging to certain ethnic groups or even being a particular color justified enslavement. As we'll see in the next section, next week, when I start to talk about Animal Bridegroom tales and the Beauty and the Beast tradition in France, those stories have within the narratives themselves a rationale for the animal birth or for the transformation. That is, they give a reason for the cursed state of the male protagonist. In Basile's tales, we never have that, right? We only have, just on the surface, these handsome Black slaves who we know are cursed for some reason. And the fact that Basile's never articulates in his tales why these characters are cursed or why they're cursed to Blackness suggests that Blackness was already a widely understood and very culturally comprehensible, accepted, naturalized form of punishment, right? That, I think, is a fairy tale elaboration of what Epstein is saying here. Even more, I think it's not Blackness, it is Blackness and not slavery that's the real punishment or curse in these tales. And that becomes especially clear with the handsome slaves because they retain their humanity and male privilege throughout their experience as slaves, right? You'll remember, they continue to function as the masters of their households, their palaces, and in both cases, they have slaves of their own. In addition, they return to whiteness at night when they join the heroines in bed. So we can think about that early form of Mediterranean slavery, which was temporary, remember, and apply that to these contexts, to these male slaves, and ask ourselves about male privilege, especially when we think about the female slaves in the story and the ways that their slavehood is permanent, right? And it's so deeply a part of them. They're not cursed, they simply are. And given the transitional moment that we're in, as well as the fact that more slaves in Naples at the time were female, I think we see this Basile working through some of these ideas in the differences in these pairings, if you will. But nonetheless, despite the gender differences in Basile's slaves, their racialization still establishes a paradigm that gets metaphorized in later European fairy tales. So again, that is the explicit racial and racist underpinnings remain. They're still in the tales. It's just that the handsome Black slaves or the slave girls get metaphorized in other ways. And I'll be talking about that. But this is, I just want to finish with this section with one more quote from Stephen Epstein. And again, he's really talking about, his book is about the way that ideas about slavery are retained in the language of Italian, even after slaves are long gone. And just as an example, the most familiar greeting that we know from Italian, ciao, comes from scavo, slave. And this is from when people used to say to each other, basically like, I am your slave, I'm indebted to you, as a greeting, right? As a way of expressing one's love for someone. So Epstein says, long after slaves disappear, the heritage of the words and idea they struggle to express is the ultimate reckoning. The hypocrisies, the racism, the sexism, the brutality bound up with the daily practice of slavery live on in language. And I would say live on in fairy tales too. And so in the next section, I'll talk about France and a little bit about how we see that heritage continuing on. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. This doesn't fit, so I'll keep working on that. And partly it's the screen is just so small. So, but I will try to attend to that. Okay, so let's move from early 17th century Naples to late 17th century Paris, and specifically to the tales of Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy. And what I want to do is provide some of the historical, cultural, and political context for her fairy tales, which were published in 2 volumes. In 1697 and 1698. And the volumes, the first volume is called Contes de Fées, which translates as Stories of the Fairies. or fairy stories. And it's from Madame d'Aulnoy that we get the term fairy tale that we use today. And the second edition was called Suite de Contes Nouveaux ou des Fées à la mode, new tales of fashionable fairies. And again, as I mentioned last week, fairies were not always kind. They weren't always the sort of image of the fairy godmother that we have with us from probably Disney, but also from some other fairy tale collections closer to the 19th and 20th century, that there were also malevolent fairies. So fairy was just kind of like a supernatural being in some ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit after providing some of that historical and cultural context. I'm going to talk a little bit about d'Aulnoy's fairy tale The Dolphin, which maybe did anybody get Barry's email with the text? Oh, okay, so Alice. Okay, so I think that the parts that I'm going to talk about, you won't need to know the whole story, but I'll try to track the time. And wait, is that time right? 10:30, I have 20 minutes. Okay. Okay, okay, I might go 5 minutes. I think I blew it there on time-wise. And then if there's time, I'll lay some groundwork for the rest of the French material, which I'll talk about at the beginning of next week, especially Prince Marquessan and the Beauty and the Beast stories from the middle of the 18th century. So it'd be great if we can figure out how to circulate those again. So the 17th century was a time of really remarkable transition and culture change in France, especially for the aristocracy. And Madame d'Aulnoy was a member of the aristocracy. So the very idea of the nobility had been destabilized already in the 16th century. And in the 17th century, it was continuing to undergo threats and challenges. And basically the rising merchant class, that is the bourgeoisie, were finding all sorts of ways to take advantage of the period's radical and social transformations in order to insert themselves into the aristocracy, or to remake themselves as nobles. And at the same time, aristocratic women were attempting to challenge the increasingly conservative ideas about gender, that is, ideas about what constituted proper womanhood and proper femininity. And also, these aristocratic women were trying to find ways to contest the very often brutal laws that were being put in place in order to enforce those ideas about proper femininity. So just as an example, if a husband was mad at his wife for any reason, he could charge her with being unfaithful, and without any kind of evidence, she could be incarcerated in a nunnery, not a monastery, like I don't think nunnery is the right word, but convent, thank you. And she could be there for the rest of her life, right, with no rights. So women in the early part of the 17th century, aristocratic women, they had a fair amount of rights and power, and they were seeing those diminished. And so many people have read the fairy tales written during this time period as a specific response to the gender politics. And I do think that's true, but I'm not going to be talking about that. Aristocratic women, because they were increasingly marginalized and written out of social conversation and social public spaces, and because they were also being increasingly economically disadvantaged, they really turned to the salon as a culturally appropriate space where they could challenge, indirectly, of course, conservative ideas about femininity. So salons were basically informal or unofficial, but still very powerful spaces created, again, by aristocratic women. And they enabled women's active participation in knowledge production, basically, in the production and dissemination of literature, of science, of philosophy, of early linguistics, and of sociocultural ideas generally. This was a space where women could cultivate themselves and could make very clear that they were critics, they were writers, and they were people endowed with reason, just like men. And the salons are also notable for being spaces where women and sometimes men, they were mixed. They were not exclusively for women, but women ran them. Salons also became famous as spaces where predominantly women, but sometimes men, read aloud their fairy tales that they had written to each other. So this became a very fertile space for the protection of fairy tales in the late 17th century. And in fact, the salon is generally credited with being the kind of facilitator of the rise of the literary fairy tale in France and for ushering in what's known as the fairy tale vogue of the late 17th century in France, but that also extended into the United Kingdom and also well into the next century. So of the many, and there were many, of the many aristocratic female fairy tale writers of this period, Madame d'Aulnoy is by far the most famous. She was born to a very well-connected family, and she has a completely outrageous story of her own, which I don't have time to tell you, but you could probably find it on Wikipedia or reach out to me. I'd be happy to tell it to you sometime. But she went on to become a very popular as well as prestigious writer. And in addition to fairy tales, she wrote novels, she wrote her memoirs, she wrote accounts of her travels, much of which was probably fictionalized, but still accounts of her travels. And most of her works were issued by Claude Barbin, who was a bookseller and a very influential bookseller who also published works by La Fontaine, by Racine, Molière, right? So these are names that we still recognize today. And her fairy tales were, and her travel writings were almost immediately translated into English, and they remained in print throughout the 18th century. So she was very well known in her days. The fact that Madame d'Aulnoy wrote both fairy tales and travel literature is, in my opinion, of particular significance for understanding how ideas about race might be operating in her tales. And of course, I should point out that even though I want us to think about how race and ideas about race and racial thinking is influencing fairy tales over a long period of time, I want to be very clear that I think that's happening in distinctly different ways in these different historical and cultural moments, right? So we talked about slavery and the language of slavery in Basile, and now a very different approach here in France at the end of the 17th century. Fantastic literature, like fairy tales and travel, have long enjoyed a very intimate relationship. That is, fantasy literature transports people to other worlds, and travel writing conveys fantasies of otherness, right? It brings fantasies of otherness home. So just as a little background, during d'Aulnoy's time, travel writing was incredibly popular. It was probably one of the most popular genres there. And obviously, I think d'Aulnoy's own travel writing, her own travel narratives, suggests that she would have been very familiar with this genre. The genre we might think of as kind of travel narratives was also much more expansive. It included, for instance, letters, published letters from missionaries who were in New France, or the Jesuit relations, accounts by Jesuit missionaries, for instance. And people wrote about their travels and their adventures all over the world, including Europe, and then especially the Orient, and also the New World. And so I am suggesting that reading Madame d'Aulnoy's fairy tales in relationship to travel writing of the period is particularly fruitful for understanding the marvelous worlds that she creates as rooted in or linked to very specific geographical locations with very specific kinds of inhabitants that are informed by race, right? And I should just add that when we look at all of the travel writing that was produced during this period in France, the vast majority of it was about, quote, the Orient. But when we look at that relative, those relative numbers from an ethnological or anthropological perspective, what we find is there's very little writing about the people of the Orient in these travel narratives, and there's a ton of writing about the people of the New World. And this kind of makes sense because at the time, people thought of the Orient as highly civilized in many ways. They also thought it was barbaric and problematic in many ways, and that's Edward Said's book, Orientalism. But for the most part, they acknowledge this is like an evolved society, and we have cultural imports from them, et cetera. Whereas the New World, that was like a tabula rasa, that to be inscribed with European fantasies. There was no understanding of who these people were or what they were. So there was a great deal of writing produced about the inhabitants of the New World. Let's see. So resonating with exactly this kind of possibility for imperial inscription, right? D'Aulnoy's fairy tale, The Dolphin, which I had hoped you would read for today, really offers very, I think, idiosyncratic and provocative details that might be read as articulating a politics of French Empire. And as such, it provides a framework for thinking about the rest of D'Aulnoy's tales as part and parcel of an expanding French colonial mission, if you will. So the dolphin is particularly striking for the fact that it has a dolphin as the benevolent helper or as the magical helper. The dolphin was quite rare as a rescuing figure in fairy tales and mythology of the time. And indeed, if we look at the most exhaustive source, the Encyclopedia of Fairy Tales produced in Germany, that is really a definitive kind of word on all things fairy tales. If we look at the entry under dolphin in the Encyclopedia of Fairy Tales, there are only 2 Greek myths, 1 story in the Arabian Nights, 1 story in a collection of Malagasy tales, and then D'Aulnoy's tale. So again, that's a very, very small number. The Encyclopedia of Fairy Tales published in the late 20th century and maybe even into the early part of the 21st century. So contemporary. So it's looking all the way back to antiquity and sees only about these 5 tales, right? So this already is an unusual protagonist, or unusual magical helper. But even more significant, I think, than the rarity of the dolphin in fairy tales and mythology is the fact that the dolphin was also the symbol of the French monarchy, right? The heir or heirs apparent to the throne were referred to as le dauphin, the dolphin. And the dolphin had a place of prominence on the French monarchy's coat of arms. So Louis XIV, for instance, was the 19th Dauphin of France until he assumed the throne in 1642. And he also sired 4 Dauphins. So when in the story, the dolphin takes, quote, the shape of a young monarch of marvelous beauty and wit, unquote, in order to attend the wedding of Prince Alidor and Princess Leverette, I think we see an association that cannot just be coincidental. Yet, strangely, despite the dolphin's royal status, he remains beholden to Alidor and continues to serve as a magical benefactor throughout. So you'll remember, or you'll see when you read the story, that when Alidor and Leverett and their son are in danger of drowning because they're in a barrel floating at sea, Alidor calls the dolphin and transfers his power to command the dolphin to Leverett, who requests that he, quote, bear them away to the loveliest island in the world, and to build on it the finest palace that ever was seen, with exquisite gardens surrounded by streams, one full of wine and another of water, with a garden full of flowers and a tree in the middle, whose stem should be silver and its branches gold, with 3 oranges growing on it, one of diamond, another of ruby, and a third of emerald. The palace was to be painted and gilded, and all of her story represented on its walls. So this description of this extravagant golden castle and the bountiful lands is extremely common in D'Aulnoy's fairy tales. And it also reproduces, I think quite clearly, the language of imagined New World plenitude, right? As you probably know, from the time of Columbus on, I think today is what used to be called Columbus Day, the New World was described as overflowing with gold, with precious gems, with food and other kinds of riches. So this is very consistent with that. Here, however, the extravagance of this marvelous new world and the bounty of it is brought about specifically through the actions of the dolphin, le dauphin, right, the young monarch. And so I want to suggest that through this wordplay, sorry, I'm having a hard time saying her name today, D'Aulnoy's marvelous world converges with the utopian possibilities of New France or of the New World. But I would say New France in particular, especially as it was described and articulated in travel writing of the period. And travel writing of the period, I would argue, is at the heart of the imperial imagination of France during this period. So if these descriptions of the Dolphin's Island evoke New France, the relationship is even more clearly articulated when the dolphin orders the local inhabitants to refer to Alidor and Leverett as king and queen. So he has created a brand new island, and yet it is inhabited already, right, by people who are asked to refer to them as the royalty of the island. As was the case with colonies the world over, this island provides an opportunity for Europeans to remake themselves. And in the case of Alidor, and especially, that's a very literal remaking for very complicated reasons that you'll be able to read about, but that is not going to distract from the point I want to make. Alidor literally becomes a handsome and witty prince, right? And Leverett, who's been dishonored and banished and sentenced to death, is restored to being a queen. And this comes about because of their arrival in this new land, right? Basically a colony. And their transformation, I would say, literalizes or narrativizes the French and other kinds of colonial fantasy of being perceived as gods or as emperor, empress upon first contact, right? That's a narrative that we're familiar with. But even beyond the respect and honor that the local inhabitants pay to Alidor and Leverett, they also find that they're the recipients of infinite wealth, right? There is a stream of wealth, or stream, yeah, it's a stream of wealth. And that really, again, reproduces this kind of idea that New France or the New World was so full of riches. So the streams of metal flowed into these wells, and when money was wanted, one had nothing to do but to let down a bucket and say, I wish to draw up louis, pistoles, quadruples, crowns, and other coins. At the word, the water took the wished for form and the bucket came up full of gold or silver or coins, and yet the spring never dried up for those who made good use of it, which is, of course, the colonizers. Of course, Alidor and Leverett want to try this out, wouldn't you? So they pull up a bucket and it's full of golden grains, and they're a little bit confused. And so they say, why is this just golden grains? Why have these coins not been, or why has this gold not yet been coined? And what they learn is that they, I guess the magical beings who coin the gold are, quote, waiting to know the arms of the prince and princess so as to stamp them, right? Mm-hmm. But Alidor chooses another insignia for the coins. He claims, we are too much indebted to the generous dolphin to have any other image on them than his. And in an instant, all the grains were changed into gold pieces with a dolphin on each. Okay. Fascinating. Alidor's and D'Aulnoy's decision to have the coins stamped with the image of the dolphin, I think, is especially noteworthy because the only French coins in the 16th and 17th century that had the stamp of the dolphin on them were intended for circulation exclusively in New France. And so here's a picture of the coin. It's pretty hard to tell, especially in the first one, because it's kind of a blob. But in the second one, where I have the arrow pointing, you can see the dolphin there. Okay, let's see. Thinking, should I? Can you guys stay 5 minutes? Okay, okay. Then I have to go because I have a department meeting. Okay, so if D'Aulnoy's story, The Dolphin, seems to conceive of this marvelous world and the new world in a shared imperial imaginary, I think it also reveals a certain utopianism common to D'Aulnoy's fairy tales and also to the early colonial mission and hopes for New France. So although French, not surprisingly, French colonial projects in North America were vexed at almost every turn, early explorers and religious missionaries wrote with great hope about the possibilities for New France and its native people. So for instance, in a 1642 letter to a lady of rank, basically this is a fundraising pitch, Marie de la Carnation, who was a very famous Ursuline missionary and whose letters were published in France in 1677 and 1681, and as I mentioned, would have been read as a kind of travel literature. She wrote, "It seems that the fervor of the primitive church has descended to New France, and it illuminates the hearts of our good converts, so that if France will give them a little help, in a short time, a much further progress will be seen." And then Father Paul Lejeune, one of the first Jesuit missionaries in New France, which again is Canada basically today, conveys a similar hope in the Jesuit relations of 1632 and 1633. Since they, our poor savages, interest themselves in the glory of God and in the spread of the gospel and the conversion of souls, we feel an inexplicable and affectionate interest in their affairs. So much so that if things would go according to our wishes, they would gain more in 1 month than they have lost in all the years that their plans have been thwarted. I hope in a few years they will see the fruits of heaven and of earth growing from the seeds which they have planted with so much trouble. This optimistic faith in conversion and progress and deliverance accords with French philosophies and discourses of human perfectibility at the time. So by the 17th century, human perfectibility was no longer considered only the domain of God as it had been, nor was it attributed only to one's free will. Rather, it was seen as something that could be brought about by one's fellow man through the deliberate intervention of one's fellow man. So this belief in human perfectibility, of course, I think, supported French colonial policy through the illusion of perfectibility and assimilation. Basically, we are to make these natives assimilated French people. A French historian, Saliha Belmessus, makes this point in describing the role of assimilation in both French and British colonization. Through the pursuit of assimilation, empire was driven by the utopian project of transforming colonized peoples not only into Europeans, but more particularly into improved Europeans. Colonizers wanted colonial peoples to be what they themselves were not yet. So what I'm laying the groundwork here for, and what I'm trying to suggest, is that it is exactly this faith in the utopian possibility of human perfectibility and human transformation, characterized sometimes by Christianity, but not only by Christianity, that kind of faith saturates Madame D'Aulnoy's tales of animal metamorphosis and transformation, right? Especially those with animal bridegrooms that I'm going to have you read for next week, and also the Beauty and the Beast tales. So there we go. Just a few minutes late. I apologize for my timing. And next week, hopefully, you'll have the tales. Yeah, Mark. Yeah, so for next, so the dolphin is the one that I talked about today. Next week is Prince Marquessan. And also I included a copy of Madame Le Prince de Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast, which is the version that most people know, although I'm going to talk about a different version as well. And then there are two tales from the Grimm's collection also in that email from Barry, as well as the material from Basile. I don't know why most people haven't gotten it though. I got a copy of it.
Yes. Yeah.
The list of email addresses should be correct.
Or you can email me directly and I can send it to you. My email address is lau@ucsc.edu. That might be easier since Barry's away, right?
So, presumably Clara will upload the recording to our OLLI YouTube channel.